Welcome to the podcast, Animals Say What? Today we discuss what German Shepherds and bonobos have to say. With guests Sue Savage-Rumbaugh and Chaz Selph. So I guess to start, I wanted you and Chaz to introduce yourselves.
Sure, I'll let Sue go ahead first.
Well, my name is Sue Savage-Rumbaugh. I've worked with apes since 1970, and I focused mostly on language, culture, and tools.
Yeah, my name is Chaz Selph. I was educated in history at UCLA with my undergrad and became interested in computer programming on a practical level after that, and have been doing that in my career since. And as of the past year, after getting a German Shepherd puppy, have fallen in love with animal cognition and teaching and trying to understand non-humans in the non-human mind. And this took me, obviously, to Sue Savage-Rumbaugh's research. And that's how I came across her research with lexicograms, and with our what is now 1-year-old Ava, tried to take a little bit of her approach with Kanzi the bonobo and teach Ava, our dog, how to speak and understand, comprehend, and produce English.
Sounds great. Yeah, Ava just turned 1. Peanut's 3.
Did you get Peanut when he was a little bitty puppy, or?
I did, yeah. He was like 8 weeks. They told me he was a Chihuahua Shih Tzu combo, and he's definitely not. I think he might be part pug. So he's a unique little guy. Yeah.
He really is great with comprehension and listening. He's so good with that. He just doesn't vocalize like Ava does, which is just the main difference.
It's interesting that you find this difference among individual dogs. It may be more rearing than species. I don't really know. I haven't paid enough attention to dogs. I know Max doesn't vocalize very much because he thinks it's not really good to bark like a dog, and that he should be quiet. But he can do it,
Yeah, I wonder if it's because we often train them not to bark at people or inside.
Evolution of the human brain. And so we've just been talking about how we've evolved from non-primates to primates to humans. And a lot of what we've been discussing is language, because it seems to be uniquely human, which I think is something that you guys are trying to fight against. And what I've seen, it doesn't seem to be uniquely human. So yeah, I wanted to do a discussion on that to kind of get the word out, I guess, a little bit. So my first question is, what similarities in language do you see between yourself and Kanzi?
The most unique thing about human language is just the way we produce the sounds, the way we produce the consonants and the vowels. And Kanzi produces consonants and vowels, but he has a different shaped vocal tract. And so they don't sound as distinct. It sounds more like Kanzi is sort of singing, or not sometimes to people screaming when he's really trying to talk. And my feeling is that our ears are attuned to human language, and that's why we think that other organisms don't really have a language. Kanzi, being around us from the time he was a baby, began to attend to our language, and his ear became attuned to it. His mother really couldn't understand anything that we were saying for maybe at least 15 or 20 years. And then she started to seem to understand a few words. But he was quite aware that she was speaking some kind of a language and that we were speaking some kind of a language. So I would say he grew up as a bilingual bonobo. And he was even aware that there were concepts that we talked about that if he tried to translate them for his mother, she couldn't understand the concept, so it didn't matter to try to translate it. But other things you could ask Kanzi to tell Matata, and he'd turn to her and speak. He would vocalize. And oftentimes she would tell him what foods she would like to have, and then he would tell us at the keyboard. The biggest difference I felt between our languages was the actual production of the sounds. You can't get to the real deeper cognitive differences as long as that's in your way.
Yeah, you talk about like these intermediary translations, like Kanzi serving as a translator for Matata or to you, or the keyboard serving as an intermediary for understanding language, when really, ideally, the spoken word is what we would like to hear and be able to communicate with. And there could be that going on with bonobos. It's just that the human ear is not attuned to those pitches like Kanzi. It just tells you like what all is out of our hearing range.
If it's not something that we do as humans or something we can understand, we just like, well, they must not communicate, but they do it in a unique way that we don't understand.
I think for a very long time, humans were trying to come up and out of the jungle, so to speak, and become civilized and become distinct from animals. And then we began to use animals as beasts of burden. First, we hunted animals. And when we hunted animals, we had from looking at cave drawings and things like that, a completely different, much more spiritual kind of relationship with them and understanding of them, and felt a part of them. But now, they're just raised in a slaughterhouse, and you never even think that a steak is actually an animal, or that a cow could have language. Of course, people wouldn't eat it if it had language, but of course it couldn't possibly have language, or it wouldn't be a cow. But then there are these strange creatures in between called dogs, and now people have become very interested in dogs. They become very interested in a lot of other animals as we become, I guess you would say, far more civilized. We kind of miss nature, and we want to bring little pieces of it into our house with us, and we wish we could live in it, and understand it, kind of be a part of it. There are many people that, still try to do that. That's one of the desires behind camping and things of that sort. So we're kind of coming full circle to a new level of understanding of non-humans. Now, as we come to that, there's all kinds of computer abilities that we can use to really try to make that connection in a way we never really could have had before, even if we had desired to do it. I think maybe we had to get away from animals in order to come back to them in a more reflective, thoughtful, caring way.
I listened to something you said, that there's no place in human society for bonobos. Like the only place we put bonobos, and this can be said for many non-humans, is in the natural world, because we don't really make a place for them in a human world. But with dogs, you really upend that, because you call them literally man's best friend. They are in our world. What you were saying is lacking in this kind of cold, modern approach towards not touching bonobos, not extending this loving, equalizing relationship. Like, actually, dogs are kind of a great species to start out with to do that, because they really do have a place that's in our world, and they do show a motivation they share goals with us, and so that they obviously work with us. They could literally earn, if they could leverage a union, work at like the canine at the military. They perform work, and there's a lot of animals that don't have that can't leverage any economic value. So if a cow could be worth more than its meat, I'm sure it would love the opportunity to do that. But yeah, it's interesting that now this research has come around, like what you can't really do now with a lot of species, you can still do with dogs. And so they're uniquely situated in the human world to make a difference and to be able to communicate. And if you can't do it vocally, then with an intermediate device.
So people are beginning to extend human-like communicative characteristics to dogs, and dogs are responding to those. Before there became this interest in dogs, really this interest in dogs only came after Kanzi.
Mm-hmm.
And many people didn't have a Kanzi, so they started talking to their dogs.
Right.
And their dogs started listening. And actually, people have started talking now to elephants and birds and all kinds of animals if you just look at YouTube. And while people may not know that it started with Kanzi, it pretty much did start with Kanzi. And the way Kanzi was treated and the descriptions of what that treatment did. And it's very interesting to me that so many people seem to pick up on it so easily. And it went really quite easily into the field of children with language difficulties. And now there's this book by Hunger, who has learned this as a speech therapist for kids and is now, trying it to dogs. So an idea can really travel. And it can travel so fast now, particularly with YouTube. And it doesn't need to be limited to scientists, which when we're starting to talk about something like natural communication, everybody feels they can be a part of that. Everybody might not be a part of a mathematical equation, but everybody's a part of natural communication.
For sure. The TikTok has been a big talk in my class with the clever pet.
Apparently they're really the hot button topic, I guess these courses and these seminars.
Tell me about what you're seeing or that people are seeing on Clever Pet that is indicative that the dogs really are communicating.
There have been studies about gifted word learner dogs that it's possible, and it's been demonstrated with Chaser and Rico, and it's been published. It still is a question of how much do they, I guess Sue puts it in this way. It's an action and a response, a behavior trick, right? Which can be done, but I think what Sue's methodology really revealed with Kanzi is that unstructured training, encountering things in an exploratory way, learning language as a child would learn it, not decoupling the bonobo from the human world, but raising it just like you would raise a child in the same environment is what helped enable Kanzi to learn language and use it in instances which I think maybe other bonobos can but haven't. And I don't know if other researchers have exactly modeled off of Sue's methodology to kind of recreate what she had as kind of like a family, really, is what it was. There's this like cold scientific detachment with the way we treat non-humans that I don't know if other species other than domesticated ones can really wedge into that space.
Yeah, what I've been learning in my research with the lab, I imagine that, Sue, your research with Kanzi was very abnormal because you did have a bond, but it would limit the experiences with these primates and stuff being raised alongside humans instead of behind glass.
Well, the gardeners were the really first modern ones to try to explore if apes could learn language and if what they learned was more than just a conditioned trick, so to speak.
Mm.
And the work prior to the gardeners had been to try to teach apes to talk. And that was really hard for them to do, like it's hard for Peanut to do. But when they started using signs, it was easy then for the chimps to use signs. And so they said, oh, the chimps are talking. And then a whole dialogue broke out about, well, what is talking? What is human language? How do we know they're really thinking the way we're thinking when we talk? Then the whole field of animal cognition broke out of that, saying, well, it's just so difficult to determine if they're thinking when they use language. We'll just see if they're thinking when they're thinking. We'll just look at just thinking. And it's not that easy, really, to be thinking without a languaged brain. You can think of images, you can hear sounds, you can think of things that aren't words. But the way in which your brain handles that information, if it's a languaged brain, it's going to handle it differently. One of the reasons we have such difficulty remembering before we had language is because our brain was handling the world differently. And we had to move into a world where there are sounds that represent things. And we have to pay attention to and understand those sounds that represent things. And we have to try to negotiate what the intended meaning is. And if it's an arbitrary sound, you don't have any way of assessing the inner state of the mind of the dog. But that may come very soon with either internal ways of measuring brain waves or external ways of measuring brain waves. It may happen very quickly that we can look at the internal states of non-humans. Now, there's recently been studies with MRIs that show that dogs use a number of different sections of their brain to understand human language, and they're showing MRI responses to complex sentences as though they are processing them. So with that kind of information, people will begin to treat dogs differently. One of the hardest things about children that don't have language, you treat them the way you might treat another child, but they don't respond to the mother or the father the way another child does. And then you don't really know what to do because you're not getting the response. A bonobo can give you a response that's quite sufficiently human to be able to be understood. It's a little more difficult to see that in dogs, but I think you can see that in dogs. And you can see it in elephants fairly easily, and people are seeing it more in cats. So once you begin to have that interchange, that dialogue at a nonverbal level, and then attach sounds to that, it's the dialogue itself that is lending meaning between the two parties. And you can have a very repetitive dialogue. Hi, how are you? I'm fine. What are you doing? I'm doing X. Did you do that yesterday? Yes. I mean, you can have conversations that have very little variability. I like to call them chatbots. And it's exactly those kinds of conversations that if you really need to know something and you're talking to a chatbot and it doesn't have that loop in it, you're not going to find it out. You're never going to get out of that loop. The chatbot can't figure out what it is that you don't know, and it's not even trying. It's not going to try. It's conditioned in a way. But if you're having a miscommunication with a living organism, it's a different thing. And the more complex its brain is, and the more complex its so-called nonverbal behavior is, and the more complex the history of the interaction between you and that non-organism are, the more likely it is that you will find a way to correct any misunderstanding. It's revealing that language is kind of like a layer of skin, an onion placed on top of behavior, and we use it to talk about behavior. And then we can try to use it to change behavior in certain ways, and we can keep adding more layers to that onion skin until the language becomes so complex we may not realize that we have fallen into conditioned speech. This is what Skinner tried to deal with in his book Verbal Behavior, and it's what Duane and von Glosserfeld tried to deal with in Lana. And in Lana's case, they had every single utterance that she ever made. They didn't record all of the context because they didn't know how, and they didn't realize how important it would be. But you see in Lana a clear attempt to figure out what Tim is thinking, a clear understanding that Tim is saying something, but I don't think that's what Tim means. I don't think that's what Tim is thinking. And if it is, it's violated my rules of language. You see that coming out in Lana's behavior and in her use of the keyboard. Whether or not anyone will get to that point with a dog, I don't know. But when you get to that point, I mean, I can't imagine getting to that point with a chatbot ever.
It's not worth the attempt almost. Like, I don't really want to engage with an inorganic being as much. It's not as interesting as an organic one that's alive.
Well, but if you didn't know which it was, would it really matter?
There's the question, I suppose. Yeah, if it could trick me, the Turing test, into thinking it's organic, but then that's when we fall on my understanding of language. And it's interesting how language can be so amorphous because it depends on what you know. They're building blocks of language that are embedded in cultures that you can't, it's hard to uncouple these things from culture, like you've described before. Even the creation of a new word can have power in language and move culture in a certain way and move meaning to where it cascades back on itself and changes the meaning. It's like it's recursive in that way. And it has this movement, this fluidity in time. It moves forward in a dialogue almost with itself.
So that kind of capacity is what I try to look for when I look at tapes of fluent pets doing fluent pet things with fluent pet owners.
Mm-hmm.
And I haven't probably looked at nearly enough, but it just seems like it's missing. I have no doubt that a dog can punch a button that says, I want to go outdoors or I want food. And the dog does want to go outdoors and the dog does want food. And the dog could probably punch a lot of other buttons. It really understood. I'm not doubting that at all. That's one of the reasons I'm interested in having you and Chaz work with a dog like Ava. What I think causes a problem in Fluent Pet is that there's a lot of buttons put there that the dogs don't really understand. And when they punch them, the people are supposed to do something. And then the people invent some very unusual things. I don't know, like the dog that wants 8 kinds of broccoli. Does the dog really want 8 kinds of broccoli? Or if you do it the first few times and then to get them to punch another button.
When the bonobos were communicating about where they wanted to go, did they vocalize?
They vocalized in the wild, and Kanzi and Anysja Roberts vocalized. They could also point at pictures, and they could also gesture. They'd also look with their eyes.
Okay.
They seem to have lots of different ways, and there were some times that I felt like they were either communicating mind to mind or they were vocalizing at a frequency that my ears couldn't hear, but they were clearly communicating. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know the mode.
That's good to know, because our class was wondering why other beings such as bonobos haven't developed a language like we have, but maybe they have and we can't hear it, or it's too high pitched, or they don't have a desire to communicate as much as humans do.
In order to make something like a word, we need consonants and vowels. But it's not really a consonant and a vowel. It's really a tone and a click. And that's what I've tried to explain to Chaz. When you can hear a musical song played, but instead of hearing music, you hear the language itself. Because the tones and clicks are combining in a rate and at a pattern that your brain turns on its language processor. And if your brain is expecting human language, it has to have the relationship between those tones and those clicks at a certain rate. And then it turns on its language processor.
I'll give you another example, actually. Like just today, I was listening to something you did, Sue, some recording. I was just listening to it passively for like a half hour or something. And you were just speaking regularly, and Ava was on the coffee table, and then you imitated Kanzi. And this is going to speak to the fact that she's expecting something to happen a certain way, and linguistically something happens that's new. She's not expecting it. It's like, and so you imitate Kanzi, and you're like, wah, wah! And then Ava goes like paying attention, right? Because it's outside the bounds of what the English she was hearing, and the blah, 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 that she just droned out. But it suddenly became like of meaning to her because suddenly you did it again. Wah, wah! And she was just so like intrigued at what was going on. And it just speaks to that. It's correct. It's just a random click and a sound or a syllable or two syllables. John Pilley said he named Chaser he akined it to two just random utterances that meant nothing at the time, but to Chaser, the dog, but became meaningful to him over time, because it was his name. But at the time, it just sounded like two random syllables you put together, and the same thing was, wah, wah! At once, it's like, whoa, what was that? But it's new at once, and then it can become acquired and embedded into your language. Your name is your identity almost. You carry it around in your culture, like as your flag, your name. So it is the most embedded property of yourself in language and culture. It's your name. Anyway, I love when I heard that on the podcast, I was taken aback too. So I was like, oh, but I loved it. It just makes you want to hear what the bonobos really sound like in person. Because I imagine if it's in real life, it's just all the more ever present and powerful.
Well, you can hear that on Claudine Andre's website, Lola Ya Bonobo, or Friends of the Bonobos. They're changing it now to bonobo.org, I think. She calls it rewilding. They have taken some of the bonobos that were part of the bushmeat trade and taken from poachers and raised by Claudine Andre and people that helped her, and then formed a larger group and then eventually put back in the wild. And when they go to see that group, you can hear them making wah sounds. The group is all rushing down, and they're so exciting that they're coming. And you can hear lots of bonobo sounds if you go to her website.
I'll check that out, and I'll play it for Ava, too. I'm sure she'll find it very interesting.
I'm curious, since Matata didn't really seem to understand the lexigrams, did she try to teach you guys her language to communicate with her ever, or Kanzi?
Yeah, when she first started, she would take me out in the forest and take me by the hand and just name things and then look in the distance and say things. Like she was really trying to teach me her language. And people always say, well, it all just sounds like bonobo peeps. That I did have that problem, and I expressed it. I felt like she was saying different words, and I could not hear different words.
Yeah.
And the problem was not her, it was me.
Yeah. You're not able to listen for their language either. That's interesting.
And she couldn't hear my different words, but you see, Kanzi being a baby and being sort of co-reared, it didn't bother him that we were different. He just learned it. You know, like if part of your family speaks Spanish and part speaks English, you just learn it. You don't really think anything about it. Kanzi was able to do that, which is a clear sign that bonobos have language. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to do that.
Right.
So with Ava, you don't have like a group of dogs and a dog mother, and then time with the dog mother and time with Chaz and time with the other dogs, and telling the other dogs about what Chaz is doing and telling Chaz about what the other dogs are doing.
Came from my class. We were discussing what our projects were going to be. And they were curious if Kanzi, would he try to teach lexicograms to the bonobos around him? Or I guess if he was reared with other bonobos, he would probably just revert back to bonobo talk.
Well, yeah, he's pretty much reverted to bonobo talk now because he doesn't have hardly any access to the lexicograms, and the people that work there don't really use them.
Yeah.
So I don't know what he would do. One of the things he and Pambanisha both did quite a bit when they were young was try to draw some of the lexicograms in the dirt and the forest trails along the way. And when I was in the Congo, it looked to me like bonobos were breaking branches and breaking leaves off and leaving certain symbolic messages by how they manipulated plants along the trail, especially when they wanted to leave a quiet message. So I think whenever there's a need for that, bonobos have that capability, and they would pick that ability up and use it.
Yeah. That's interesting, the leaves, because we don't really think of them as being able to write, but maybe they just use other methods to display what they're trying to say.
Yeah, well, a branch pointing this way or that way, or a V-shaped branch, it can convey a message.
Yeah. They have no need for pencils or anything. They can just use...
People use that same kind of, not identical symbols, not identical leaf symbols, but they use leaves to leave messages to each other as they walk along the trails for people they know are coming behind.
Oh, okay. I'm not much of a hiker, so I didn't know that.
I don't think we do that in this country, but they do that in the Congo.
Yeah, that's interesting. So they have a similar method as the bonobos. Did they understand bonobos, the people that live there?
Well, the history is that the humans and bonobos say that they used to live side by side, and the humans could climb trees, and we were different species, but we considered each other sibling species, and we helped each other, and we had a common language. And then we discovered fire, and we really wanted to keep our fires going. And the bonobos learned how to make fire from us, but they would always let their fires go out and travel on. Mm-hmm. And because we wanted to keep our fires going, we figured out how to take these big leaves that we used to make nests out of in the trees when we lived as leaf people, and put these over to make huts with a little hole in them for the smoke, so we could always keep our fires going.
That's cool. So it goes with like the travel you were saying. Kanzi really wanted to travel, but people don't.
Well, we did before we enamored with fire.
Mm-hmm. Then we kind of colonized, and
villages grew up around our fires.
Yeah.
Well, and what that allowed too, I think Sue has written a paper to this point, is when people congregate, you feel safer, you feel more secure, and then you feel more secure making a vocalization, which might reveal your location in the forest. So your security in numbers allows this space for language to develop where it might not have before.
So this kind of segue away from that a little bit, but something I was curious about is Kanzi knew a lot of words, and then he had 450 lexicograms or so. Did he ever request you to make a new lexigram for a word that he didn't have yet?
I don't guess we had a way for him to say, I want a new word.
What would the process be like to add a new word? Would it be your discretion as to whether a word gets added?
I just tried to have words that I thought he would want to use, and it was just, my guess. It would have been better to have been able to have him be able to say any word he wanted. That's the reason that Cats chose to start with spelling instead of lexicograms.
Oh, really?
And so Bo can essentially spell any word that he knows or understands. He's not limited to what's on the board. His uptake was much slower than Kanzi's, and he always wants to use his hand when he spells. But she also immersed him in 2 languages, Hebrew and English, simultaneously. He had a long uptake before he finally started using language, but he clearly understands both languages really well. And when I'm communicating with him or she's communicating with him in English, he understands most of everything we say and what we're going to do, and so do I. And then as soon as Aya switches to Hebrew, it's clear he goes right on understanding, and I'm lost.
Yeah. Interesting.
That's crazy. That's similar to humans, at least I've heard. If kids are raised in a bilingual household, it takes them longer to pick up the languages, but then they're like way more advanced, I think, in language than people that just have one.
Yes. Yeah.
I wonder what word Kanzi would.
Well, his favorite movie growing up was Quest for Fire, and I bet he would have liked a symbol for that.
But probably a request one.
The video tape, itself.
Yeah. You probably didn't want that.
That's why we put fire on the keyboard. We didn't put quest and we didn't put for because I didn't know how to determine if he understood those. And at that point, I wasn't going to put anything that I didn't know how to test.
Mm-hmm.
But later on, I was going to put on things that I did know how to test because I knew they mattered and I knew he needed them. And I wished I had started with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't mean to suggest for a moment that, I knew how to do everything right. I was, like Chaz has said, most of the time I just played catch up. But I was trying to catch up, and I was giving him lots of credit because I was so interactive with him. It's so easy to tell whether or not you're getting any response. If it's outside the cage and you've got to measure it some way 100 times, you're just never going to get there. It's got to be that natural, flexible. I said this, do you understand it? And he's like, no, but do you understand what I'm doing? It just goes back and forth really fast like that,
Yeah.
And he's talking to me at the same time. He's vocalizing and he's understanding most of what I'm saying, and I'm understanding a little bit of what he's saying. It's very humbling.
Are you taking the time to answer my questions?
Oh, I appreciate you presenting this project in class, and I hope they like it.
I hope so too. I'm sure they will.
They'd like it better if Kanzi was on it.
Oh, they would, for sure.
One day.
Yes, that would be so cool.